So we get to join in on this love energy for the month of April. And the theme that I chose for this month was healing from trauma. Take a deep breath, y'all. I know that this is going to be a really uncomfortable topic for some of y'all, right? I know sometimes I've gotten in the past when I've raised some, let's say, hairy issues in our spiritual spaces and places, the commentary like, can't you just give an uplifting message? And yes, I can. But as I told you from the very beginning when I came here, that part of my job and part of a minister job really is to, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And so that is really what I come here today. And so I just invite everyone to just really be in a space of openness as we kind of go on this journey here today and in this month. There's a really important topic. And this is becoming even more important in the church world. And that's why I feel like I want to share this with you all today. There's much conversation in all sorts of realms of church, evangelical realms, etc., around looking at the church and preparing the church as a trauma-informed church center space. And so a lot of this comes from what is being observed in the world and what is being observed in spiritual spaces. Many of you may or may not know and experience what it's like being in a church environment if Sundays is your jam and you may not be involved in other things or you may not go to fellowship. And so there's a lot that is happening in our communities. There is a lot of pain. There is a lot of suffering. There is a lot of ways in which we are engaging in the world in a way that doesn't serve us in our communities because we have unprocessed trauma. I've talked to even people in the medical profession, like my acupuncturist, for example, who says that she's seeing all sorts of things now after the pandemic, with anxiety and all sorts of other issues around really trauma response that are unprecedented. We look at the research, and there's copious amounts of research, so if you don't want to believe me, you don't have to. But I come from a really data-informed background, and so for me, I go to what the scientists are saying and what other spiritual leaders are saying. I look at what's really happening, not just from my own experience. Just this past year, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, released a Surgeon General advisory calling attention to the public health crisis of loneliness, isolation, and lack of connection in our country. Even before the onset of COVID-19, approximately half of US adults reported experiencing measurable levels of loneliness. So disconnection fundamentally, which research shows, affects our mental, physical, and social and spiritual health. In fact, loneliness and isolation increases the risk for individuals to develop mental health challenges in their lives. Lacking connection can increase even the risk of premature death, like smoking daily. So these are really important things as we kind of think about what is happening. I looked at an article. There's a website called churchleaders.com that collects many different articles from all over the church world, the spiritual world, from leading voices in churches today. And one pastor, Mike Leake, shared this. I'm noticing this, and he's talking about this being trauma and issues and drama and chaos and in spaces. I'm noticing this not only in the church that I pastor, but in others with which I interact. I'm hearing it from many pastors. There is a reason why so many of us are feeling like failures right now, and many are looking for work elsewhere. Recently, another pastor, Russell Moore, asked in an article, "Are pastors in trouble?" The answer is yes. Yes, we are. But so are all our people. The two are connected. We have experienced collective trauma, and it's killing us because we've never really been taught how to grieve together, how to lament together, or even how to really, truly praise together. And so we default to tearing each other apart. Strong words, no? Does that hit? Does that land for anyone? So what do we do about this? How do we address this? I want to first do a little bit of level setting because many of us don't come to the conversation in the same place. And so I want to just address what trauma is very briefly. So in a nutshell, trauma is really anything that is outside the usual range of human experience that becomes very distressing to you. So anything out of the ordinary that is heavily distressing. When we think about what we know now about trauma, trauma comes from many different places. It's fetal trauma. So in the womb, things that are happening, we move into life even after birth with that trauma. Birth trauma, loss of parent, of close family, illness, high fevers, accidental poisoning, physical injuries or falls, accidents, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, severe trauma and abandonment, beatings, witnessing violence. Natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, fires, medical and dental procedures can cause trauma, surgery, anesthesia, and prolonged immobilization. We know not all of these things that our bodies experience, that we experience, can cause trauma. And then what we know is that there's something called collective trauma. So the trauma that I just talked about was things that we may experience just personally, things that are happening just in our own individual lives. And then there's this idea of collective trauma. Collective trauma is a shared psychological and emotional reaction to a catastrophic event affecting a very large number of people. The people surviving these terrible experiences not only have bad memories, but also suffer by trying to make sense of them through mental reconstructions of the traumatic event. Some of the potential collective traumas include natural disasters, mass shootings, pandemics, terrorist attacks, war, economic recessions, and church communities. Examples of psychological, physiological, and emotional symptoms can be confusion, difficulty concentrating, anger, insomnia, nightmares, and flashbacks, guilt, shame, and fatigue. You know, we went through a pandemic for 2.5 years, or maybe more, depending on how you splice out the time frame. And then we opened up our doors and we came back to church as if nothing happened. I think we attempted to think we were going on our lives with business as usual, now kind of getting back to what was. And I know many of us have heard the idea like, well, it's never been the same, or things changed, or we can't go back to where we were now. And I've said that numerous times, and I know there have been some of you who pushed back on that idea, not really understanding maybe how the pandemic, we've done, we're over it, we're rebuilding. But what I want to suggest to you is that there's many different things that happened during that time that we still carry because we walked back into this building and we never processed it. We never processed what really happened with the social and political upheaval and unrest. We never processed what happened in our families and in our spaces and in our homes that maybe created those traumas and dramas. We never processed it. And what we know about unprocessed trauma is that it remains literally in our bodies. It becomes something that we carry with us if we don't recognize it and process it. I want to share a quote by a dean, an academic from Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Christina Edmondson, when she's talking about the definition of collective trauma. She says, "This trauma is a phenomenon that occurs when group members of a shared identity experience a horrendous event or watershed moment. It's a tattoo of pain that is left on the impacted people group. Now they find themselves with an altered lens through which to see, interpret, and navigate the world as they work to process and avoid the reoccurrence of such pain. Like all trauma, it is not simply the in-the-moment experience that marks our suffering, but the fear of re-traumatization, the avoidance of accountability by others, and the bold denial of suffering that makes a painful moment a lasting imprint." So part of this is she's talking about all of the things that make us continue at some level experiencing this or carrying it with us. I started working with this amazing book. It's Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma by Peter Levine. Anybody ever heard of that? Yep. And he is a well-known researcher. He is a PhD in medical and biological physics. He was a consultant with NASA. So a very, very well-known and accomplished scientist, researcher, writer. And one of the things I found fascinating about this book was in trying to explain this idea of trauma, he goes back to the natural world, to the animal world, to explain oftentimes what happens to us when we experience trauma. So most of us have heard, things that happen in our life and we experience something. We either fight, we're aggressing against it, we're trying to just fight against it, or we flight, we run away. But then there's the other experience that is more known now and that there's more research and understanding around, and that's called the freeze. Are any freezers here? That's me. I didn't know until rather recently, actually, quite frankly, as I started researching this more and looking at the way I've responded over time in my life, I've really been a pretty big freezer. And you can see that. So during the pandemic, my doctor, who's no longer my doctor, by the way, had me convinced that I had COVID and had me isolate, not be around anyone. I mean, I was alone in my home without my daughter. Everyone sort of had to go for over 2 months. And I distinctly remember it was Mother's Day where I had just lost my mind. I was literally losing my mind, feeling like I didn't know what was happening in my body. I couldn't breathe, but I could exercise. So I just was like, I know I don't have COVID. I was convinced I didn't, but yet everything the doctor was doing was trying to convince me that I had COVID. After Mother's Day, the next day, I finally went and waited 3 hours in line in my car, or maybe more, to be able to get a COVID test that then turned out negative. And then I felt like, okay, I can engage with the world now, because I was fearful that if I was a carrier, I have an elderly mom, yada, yada. So with that, I thought, okay, I'm out of here. I'm leaving Chicago. And I got a friend who agreed, and we decided to be in our bubble. And we went and rented a lake house in Wisconsin. And it was in that moment that we were walking and just enjoying the beautiful sunshine and outdoors and walking the road, when all of a sudden I looked up and I saw a wild turkey coming my way, flying. Now, I didn't know turkeys could fly. Did y'all know turkeys could fly? City girl had no clue. And so what normally happens if you see a wild animal approaching you? You move, right? You run, you do something. But me was like, just watching the impending doom. And my friend's way across the other side of the road, and I'm just sitting there watching it. Luckily, the turkey, did a really quick, like, oh shoot, there's a human in my way, and it was actually quite comical. It literally just grazed me and then landed and moved on. And I started to later think about the so many times in my life when that's been my response. But now it makes sense to me. Having grown up in an environment that was very violent, my community, living in the projects in Chicago, dealing with gunfire and fights, and even witnessing in my life a drive-by shooting, someone dying, all of these things I understand now sort of created my own response to things. And it might sound funny and it might sound silly, but when you look underneath what that means, it's something more than meets the eye. The ability that I didn't have to be able to meet a challenge, even in those kind of situations. But many of us don't have that ability. Sometimes it is a protective factor. Dr. Levine in his book, or rather researcher Levine, I don't know if he's a doctor, talks about, well, he is a doctor, he's a PhD. Dr. Levine talks about the fact that going into the animal world, that when there is animals that are preying on other animals, and he's talking about in one instance cheetah and impalas, that when an impala knows that they cannot outrun the cheetah, there is nowhere to hide and go, they literally just drop dead and act like, and they freeze like they're dying. Has anyone heard that about sometimes animals as a protective factor may do that for a number of different reasons? Some other predators can only attack their prey by movement. So they need to see them in movement, not in stillness, because there's something in their own eyesight or the way they engage. They can't really attack unless there's movement. But in this case, the impala just knows that it may be over. Or there might be the ability to think, if I lay down here, maybe they'll take me back to their lair and eat me later. Or maybe they're gonna go have a fiesta here and invite other friends in the family to eat me. But in that, if they think they're dead, then they may have an opportunity later to escape. We also know that physically, in animals, that there is all of these hormones, all of these metabolic processes that are happening that also, when they are freezing and they're in almost like a death state, which makes them have less pain. So that if they are going to their someone's meal, they're not going to feel the pain as much. So sometimes we do that together, as a society, as people, to also be able to weather some of the pain. But the interesting thing that he notices about the animal world is that animals, when they are in trauma response, when they kind of brush with death, something happens that after it passes, and he's talking about deers in particular, I remember a story that he had about deers, that then they observe them shaking. And they're kind of like, after the fear is gone, after the imminent threat is gone, they're sort of shaking, they're kind of convulsing, they're doing all of this physically. And what we know is that that's part of how they move the trauma through their bodies. Through movement, they literally, in that moment, process the trauma to let it go. It's been something that they biologically, or, it's something that is already in them. They're wired already to do that. In humans, that used to happen through the many different ways in which we had cultural ceremony, in which we had cultural and communal ways of engaging each other. He talks about shamanistic cultures in the past and even now in the world, about how they get together when someone has gone through trauma, and collectively they coax what they think of as the spirit that has been outside of the body back into the body, through drum, through dance, through song, through communal love. They come together to be able to bring and restore that person, or have that person create a bubble, an energetic force for that person themselves to bring themselves back. So we've lost a lot of what we can do as a society, what we have done in the past as a society to move through trauma, to process trauma. So what are we left with? Just trauma. I bring this to you all today because it's important for us to start flagging this and to start thinking through as communities, what do we do with this? Because whether we realize it or not, it is impacting our lives. You know, COVID, for example, the long-term exposure to all of this trauma, we know now, I mean, researchers have done, and still do all sorts of studies around this, that the symptoms of this acute stress that was caused by being isolated for so long, irritability, disturbances in sleep, avoidance of relationships, avoidance of difficult tasks, intrusive thoughts, decreased interest in things that used to be life-giving, difficulty concentrating, and depressed mood. Maybe there's some of you out there who have been experiencing things that you have no understanding as to why. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what's going on. You don't know why you do the things that you do, but maybe there's something here for us to latch on to at least have an understanding that we can begin to heal. Because we come with individual trauma that then is triggered by collective trauma, that then it's going back and forth in all of these ways. And then we end up hurting others and hurting ourselves. All of these losses, loss of safety, loss of connection, loss of agency, loss of hope. So what do we do with that? What do we do with this idea that maybe this is what we're happening? I want to share with you all, because we are a practical approach, right, about healing trauma. And there's a great article that I found by Dr. Thema Bryant, who is the president of the American Psychology Association, as well as a professor of psychology at Pepperdine University and an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And she has an article called The 7 Medicines for Healing Collective Trauma. The first medicine, she says, is truth. We must face the reality of our wounds to heal. Denial will not save us. Oftentimes we don't speak the truth. Those of us that speak the truth, there's the gaslighting effect. No, she's crazy, she's this, she's that. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's got her own issues, Or there's just the idea that we feel like we're the only ones. There's shame and embarrassment about talking through some of these truths. So speaking the truth, number one. The second medicine, she says, for collective liberation is to free your heart. She says we must reject the socialization that taught us to disconnect from ourselves, that taught us to disconnect from our communities, that taught us that we couldn't cry, that taught us that we had to be sorry when we cried in a public forum, that taught us that we were not worthy, that taught us that we had to be okay and justify anything that happened to us, that taught us that we couldn't justify our anger and our rage, that taught us that we couldn't have the luxury to break down, that we couldn't have the luxury to be sad or depressed, that we had to carry on with the weight of despair. She says this is not opening your heart. Opening your heart is being open to what is in there. I'm not saying constantly dig up in there and redo the trauma and reenact the trauma. I mean, we're not talking about that, but we're talking about, let's be honest with what's happening. Let's open up this space and place within us to make it okay to be in this. The third medicine, she says, is community care. And this is what I'm saying, is that we've lost this ability to care for each other together, to be in process and to be in being able to work through these things together. Dr. Levine talks about one time there was an earthquake in California, and they looked at these animal communities, how they started to congregate together even before the earthquake hit. So they saw all of these fish that started to kind of coalesce together in one space of wherever it was. And then they looked at the after effects of people in the earthquake that had to, because of poverty and not having anywhere to go, crammed together in like these community centers, versus people who were more affluent and then went through all of this alone. And they found that the people that were in the earthquake together ended up faring better with all the post-traumatic effects of having gone through that. Community. The truth is, people, we heal together. The truth is that we have been taught a mind of colonization. We've taught a mind of a way of being that is about being alone, that is about being closed-minded, that is about not trusting your neighbor, that is about distrusting, is about individualism. It's all about me, only me. I don't care about you. Let me save myself first. The goal is to rewrite that script, to create a new story, to be able to recite the love language of your ancestors, to be able to bring back those communal processes where we lived and loved together and we healed together. The fourth and last medicine that I'll share, though she has 8 or 9, is this idea of self-care. See, oppression teaches us our measures of worthiness are what we do. In our labor, in extraction, in the more that you do, the more you're valued. And your value is only what you do and contribute. Your value is only how you show up out there. But what we're learning is that it's not about the busyness that erases our spirits and our souls, that buries all of that. It's about getting back in there, about not being that cog in the wheel, about breaking that generational chain and being able to be in and of yourself and take care of yourself, to know what that means. Go lie down. Go laugh loudly. Go see a comedy show. Go journal. Go imagine. And one of my favorite, go dance. We must begin to address this, people. Our communities will not survive. I know that it is difficult. And some of us may be thinking, well, I don't have trauma. I'm good. And I will suggest to you that anybody living in this world has trauma that they carry. There is no way that you can watch the nightly news and see the horrors in the world without having some level of that is in your consciousness, that is residing somewhere in your body waiting to be healed. So let me give you some really quick strategies. These come also from my therapist, because I'm learning how to do this as well, which I share with you all. Cold showers. Anybody like the cold? Cold showers. It's about shocking that nervous system back into reset. It's about resetting. Imagine all of these things that are happening, that have happened to us, and this is how we're walking around in the world. Hello, my name is Christina, right? We don't see it. We may not always feel it, but that really is kind of how we're engaging in the world, from this shocked, kind of disembodied self. So the idea is come back. And so that cold water, sour candy, which I love, so this was a good one for me. Sour candy, right? When you take the sour candy, you're like, oh God, right? That's part of it too, shocking that nervous system. Yoga Nidra. Has anybody ever heard of Yoga Nidra? Nidra? That has become my latest obsession. So go on YouTube and look that up, because it's going into, they call it sort of deep sleep when you're awake. And so it's making you aware of every part of your body, really coming back into the body by, here's my finger, here's my thumb, here's my ankle. Yoga Nidra. And one of my favorites too that I'll share is just simple shaking. I'm trained in Qigong, and so I know you are as well. And so it's just shaking, as silly as it is, right? Come on, shake with me, y'all. All of that, just you're literally moving it out of your body, getting all of that out of you. So when you feel nervous and you feel anxious and you feel like you want to hurt somebody or hurt yourself, just start moving, start processing that. So you don't have to go into the traumatic event. We're just allowing for whatever is stuck in there to have its way out of the body. And Jesus knew this too. He was a trauma-informed healer and teacher, though we don't realize it that way. But we know from the Gospel of Thomas, verse 70, that Jesus said, if you bring forth that which is within you, then that which is within you will be your salvation. If you do not bring forth that which is within you, then that which is within you will destroy you. So I invite everyone today to kind of just really hold some space around that. Where is that showing up in your lives? Where is it showing up in your bodies? Where is it showing up in your reactions? Where is it showing up in your communities and your homes and your families, so that you can be able to, as Jesus reminds us, that restoration, that redemption, that being able to repent. Repent is not about what we've been taught necessarily, unity and new thought. It's about just changing how we see and what we think, being able to acknowledge and move forward into a new sight and a new vista. I'm going to close by just sharing a little quote from one of the Unity booklets. It's the most recent Unity booklet. And I'm blessed to have a contribution in there. The booklet is called Healing 1,000 Different Ways. And you can find it on unity.org. We may even have some in the bookstore. But this booklet is all about how do we heal. And my entry is exactly what we're talking about today. It's about healing trauma. And I'll close with this. To move through trauma, we must allow for radical joy. In the midst of the pain, we must not simply remove trauma, but replace it with new soul-enriching moments. Go to a comedy show, play in the dirt, dance like nobody's watching, or sing at the top of your lungs, la 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 la, to a favorite empowerment song. Engage the senses to build new patterns of bliss, because we can have fun while we're healing. And so it is. Thank you.